Although we're only a few weeks into 2022, a lot has happened regarding cold cases. Cases that have remained unsolved for decades, until now. The incredible advances in DNA and forensics are shining a light on more and more mysteries and helping identify killers that got away with what they did. Although in most cases those responsible for the crime have died themselves and not much justice can be found. But the families can rest easy knowing exactly what happened to their loved ones and finally move on from the tragedy. Today on the back of the archive, we're taking a closer look at 4 cold cases that can finally be considered solved in 2022. Starting with the oldest case, we're traveling all the way back to 1978 to Denver, Colorado. On December 7th at 6:15 p.m., 33-year-old Madeleine Livaudais was found stabbed in her home. Upon first inspection, it looked like someone had broken into the home and killed Madeleine by surprise, perhaps during a robbery gone wrong. 8 months later, on August 10th, 1980, the Denver police received a call at 7 a.m. A woman was lying dead in the middle of the road. The victim was 53-year-old Dolores Barajas, and she had multiple stab wounds on her body. On December 21st that same year, in 1980, another call was made to 911. At 10:45 in the morning, 27-year-old Gwendolyn was found lying on the street covered in blood. She too had been stabbed to death. A month later, on January 24th, 1981, a 17-year-old woman was found lying in a field. Her name was Antoinette Parks, and her body, just like the other 3 before her, was also covered in stab wounds. Investigations surrounding these cases were conducted separately, and for over 30 years, nobody thought they were even connected. The resources available in the 80s were not the same as the ones today, and with no witnesses and no other evidence available, the killer was never identified. However, these cases remained open for decades, and with every new forensic science advance, a ray of hope shone their way. In an investigation that began in 2013, investigators appointed to these cold cases began making connections. By extracting DNA from the different pieces of evidence gathered at the scenes, they were able to find a match that connected all 4 cases. It took years to narrow down the search, but thanks to the ever-growing DNA databases all around the United States, a suspect was finally identified. His name was Joe Michael Irvin, and during the time of the murders, he would have been in his late 20s. Police tried to locate him to confirm the DNA match, but it was not possible. Irvin died in 1981, 6 months after his last victim, Antoinette Parks, was found. In June of 1981, police officer Deborah Sue Gore tried to arrest Irvin for a traffic violation. During the arrest, there was a struggle, and Irvin got hold of her weapon, shooting directly at her and killing her on the line of duty. He was placed under arrest, but before he could be charged, he ended his own life in his cell. In January of 2022, police confirmed the DNA samples from Irvin were a match to the samples found at the scenes of the 4 stab victims in Colorado. Joe Michael Irvin was the killer. Family members of the victims have expressed their gratefulness to the police and the teams involved in solving this cold case. Although Irvin was never charged with murders, they find peace knowing this case is solved and still remember the victims as the loving mothers, sisters, and daughters that they were. Our next case takes us to 1985 Southern California, where 63-year-old Helen Brooks lived by herself in her 2-bedroom apartment in San Bernardino at a building called the Garden Apartments. Helen was hardworking. She had 2 jobs, one as a bookkeeper for a local bowling alley, and the other at a fashion boutique in the Apple Valley Inn. She was close with her co-workers, and those who knew her defined her as well-mannered and very easy to get along with. So when on July 5th of 1985, Helen didn't come into work, her boss gave her a call. After several unsuccessful attempts to contact Helen, the next call was made to the police. Officers went into Helen's apartment and found the door was unlocked. Helen was inside, but she was lying on the floor, dead. Not much information was released to the public regarding this case, and although a handful of people were questioned, police had no solid leads. Unable to do much with the evidence collected from the scene and Helen's body, the case grew colder and colder. It wasn't until 2009 when the case was reopened by cold case detectives. The evidence collected was analyzed using modern forensics technology in order to find a reliable DNA profile that could open new leads in the investigation. And the profile was found, but no matches came up in any databases. It would take over 12 years to find a match, but finally investigators have found a match that would confirm the identity of Helen Brooks' killer. His name was Robert Wortman, and he was 37 years old in 1985. After confirming his identity, investigators found that Wortman was questioned during the initial investigation. He allegedly met Helen just days before she was found dead, and witnesses placed him at the apartment building between July 3rd and July 5th when Helen was found. However, when he was first interviewed by police, he claimed to not know anything about her murder, and he said he'd never set foot into her home. At the time, investigators had no way of proving Wortman had indeed been in the house, so with no evidence pointing directly at him, he was let go. What happened to Robert Wortman after that? After an extensive and, in most cases, sexually violent criminal history, he was incarcerated for an unrelated case and was serving a 22-year sentence when, in 1995, he died. The cause of his death is not specified. Once again, although Helen's death was not fully explained, the case can finally be put to rest, and Helen's family can find peace knowing the mystery of her murder is now solved. For the next case, we're traveling to Eugene, Oregon. The year is 1986, and on June 5th, the police were called to the apartment of 62-year-old Gladys May Hensley. An employee of the building was checking up on her after not hearing from her for days. When he managed to enter the apartment, he found Gladys had been brutally murdered. A few days later, on June 19th, Janice Mary Dickinson, 33 years old, was found murdered in the back alley of a car dealership. She was naked, and she'd been assaulted. Over a year later, on February 28, 1988, police began investigating another brutal murder. 73-year-old Geraldine Spencer Toohey was found dead in her home. There were signs of forced entry, and she too had been assaulted. Just like in many cases that happened at the time, forensic science didn't allow the cases to be connected just yet. So although police worked hard to find a suspect, the lack of any strong leads in all three cases meant the murders remained unsolved and grew colder with time. In 2016, a new technological approach was taken, and the evidence was analyzed once again, trying to find DNA connections within the multiple databases now available. Using the tips received over the years, the investigation was able to narrow down 4 suspects, and after an extensive analysis, the final suspect was identified as John Charles Balsinger. Balsinger was born in 1957, making him 29 at the time of the first murder connected to him. When looking at his background, detectives learned he had several previous run-ins with the law and had served a 5-year sentence in his early 20s. He was released in 1986, and 3 months later, Gladys and Janice were found murdered within 2 weeks of each other. Police also found out that during September of 1986, he was caught breaking into a woman's house after having peered into the home from a window. The woman managed to hit him with a flashlight she had in her hand and managed to scare Balsinger off, who escaped through a window. However, he was caught soon after and was given a 5-year sentence, but he was released early and he enrolled into a community college in 1988. It was during his first few months of college when he'd murdered Geraldine. A sketch of the main suspect was released in 1988, but nobody was able to identify him at the time. However, the theory is that Balsinger saw the sketch and got scared. Seeing the two side by side, the sketch resembled him very much, and only a month later, in March of 1988, he was found dead in his own apartment. He had taken his own life. Police suspect he caved knowing that they were onto him and decided to take matters into his own hands. However, the connection between him and the 3 murders would take 35 years to come. Although it has been decades, the families of Gladys, Janice, and Geraldine now know who was responsible for taking their lives. In 1995, Nacole Smith of Atlanta, Georgia, was walking to class. Halfway there, she realized she'd forgotten an assignment due that day, so she turned around and headed back home to pick it up. She decided to take a shortcut through a wooded area to save some time. However, she never made it out of that area. Her lifeless body turned up beaten and shot to death. Police worked hard to find a suspect at the time, giving the case a lot of public view to help solve it, but despite the efforts, no solid leads were ever found. In 2004, there was a hopeful break in the case. Another case in the area had similar evidence, and investigators had found a DNA profile that placed a subject in both scenes. It would take years for investigators to actually match the profile with a name. In fact, it happened not too long ago. The Atlanta police gave a press conference in early January, confirming they have identified who took Nacole's life in 1995. Authorities decided not to publicly share the man's identity, since they don't want the focus taken away from Nacole and her family. However, they did confirm that the man died in August of 2021 from a liver and kidney failure. Nacole's mother was at the press conference, and she described the discovery as bittersweet. It's good to finally know who killed Nacole, but there were still so many questions left unanswered, and the idea of not being able to know why this happened to her daughter leaves the family with not enough closure to move on. The advances in DNA and forensic science are helping families answer questions after decades of mystery, but not all cases have fair endings. The amount of time that has gone by means many suspects are either dead or missing, and it can be hard to find closure with just a name. Either way, it's a step forward in bringing justice to the victims, and this is just the beginning of the year. In a few months, we'll revisit this topic and find out how many more cold cases have been solved thanks to DNA. If you're interested in watching other cases solved thanks to DNA, there are many more I've covered. Be sure to check the links in the description to see other videos like this one. As always, thank you for watching this video, and don't forget to subscribe if you don't want to miss any new content. See you next time.